At first I hated to read, but now I love to read. Because I'm staying on the line and I'm doing good at it, and I've been reading a lot of words a minute lately, and I went up from 70 all the way up to like 99, and it's actually pretty fun here at my school. And this is my sheet.
You get the sense, well, it was all inevitable, but none of it was inevitable. It was just a whole lot of things, all kinds of pieces eventually coming into place, creating a pattern and an understanding that we needed to do something differently.
Some of the foundational work for the intensive intervention approach that NCII takes, data-based individualization, that work began with Stan Dino at the University of Minnesota and a research group of his students, of whom I was one, and Phyllis Merkin, another faculty member at the University of Minnesota, in conceptualizing the model for progress monitoring and curriculum-based measurement that really lends itself to the data-based individualization process.
I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that if it weren't for the measurement system, there would be no NCII. Because, there's a lot more to NCII, there's a lot more to data-based individualization than the measurement system, but the measurement system is the foundation.
A long-standing research program was conducted to systematically test, what are the best ways to graph and present teachers' data, their progress monitoring students' data. What are the best guidelines for deciding when an intervention is and is not producing the rate of improvement that we need to see in a given student? And what about the data that we're collecting as part of the progress monitoring system can be used in a productive way to inform instructional decision-making in teachers in useful ways? And what other kinds of data do we need to supplement the progress monitoring data with to enrich the kinds of instructional decisions that we get in order to improve the outcome?
About 12 years ago, Lynn and Doug Fuchs invited me to participate in a symposium at CEC on what's special about special education. The symposium focused on the group of children who, even after evidence-based instruction and interventions were delivered with fidelity, failed to meet their IEP goals and master critical content and skills. We were essentially referring to those kids who were at the top of the MTSS pyramid, who need intensive support that was needed regardless of their disability label. To address the needs of this group of children with intensive needs, OSEP developed a multi-pronged strategy. First, as the foundation of the strategy, we funded a TA center, which became NCII.
We're approaching 20 years since the initial concept discussions around RTI, MTSS, scaling up progress monitoring took place in 2002 at OSEP. Since then, OSEP investments and IES research have further operationalized these processes and supported and enhanced the current implementation efforts. We've often talked about the challenge from moving from an evidence-based practice to effective implementation. And I think we've seen that in the implementation of providing intensive interventions for students. The challenge became clear that implementation effectiveness of MTS efforts at the most intensive levels for those students with intensive and persistent challenges in both academics and behavior was not where we thought it would be and not where we wanted it to be. So the idea to fund a TA center focused on developing and enhancing implementation efforts and effectiveness for MTSS for those students with these most intensive needs resulted in the NCII Center.
We, of course, were aware of the national data that indicated that kids with disabilities were really not doing well, and importantly, they didn't appear to be improving over time. So there was, I would say, an urgency with doing something that really kind of focused on this challenge.
OSEP first conceptualized the center to help states, districts, schools, and educators on how best to support these group of children. And so in response to OSEP's call for work in this particular area, the National Center for Intensive Intervention, one of the first things that they had to do, and which was a key outcome, was to identify what is it that we mean by intensive intervention. Intensive intervention, as conceptualized by the center, is a evidence-based process for intensifying and individualizing interventions. In addition to identifying what do we mean by intensive intervention, there also is required what are the components or what are the systems and processes at the state, district, and school level that are needed to support the delivery of intensive intervention.
I think this population has sort of been put to the side, and I always found that as a little bit odd, because I think most of us that do work in the area of special education probably had our starts with children who had intensive service needs, right? And so creating an opportunity for us to sort of, again, shine the spotlight on this population, bring together people who are doing work in these different domains, and creating some momentum around this, I think is important. And again, as I travel the country, or when I used to travel the country, going to meetings and talking with teachers or talking with other researchers, inevitably the conversation would always go to this group, right? Hey, I've got this intervention and it works for kids who are, who have needs, but maybe not intensive needs. I'm not quite sure what we should be doing with this group. So it created a place for us to think, plan, test, fail, retest, and think about ways that we can sort of, make a difference. And I'm a firm believer that the work that's being done by the center is going to be impactful and I think is going to change sort of the field of special education in a positive way.
It should be stressed that when we fund a new TA center, we don't assume the grantee has all the answers and will fix whatever the problem is. Rather, we assume that, as with any new concept, we have much to learn. So typically, there is a significant knowledge development component of a new center. In essence, the center engages in an iterative process. It provides TA based on what they know or think they know that is supported by some level of evidence.
During the early days of the center, internet searches of the term intensive intervention actually yielded information about competitive weightlifting. It simply was not a term commonly associated with providing services to students with severe and persistent learning and behavior needs. Today, we see intensive intervention as the focus of educational research agendas, grants, conference strands, and special issues of journals. We are proud to have been a part of the expansion of awareness and implementation of this critical educational practice. Since 2011, NCII staff and partners have provided ongoing, targeted, and intensive technical assistance to educators and leaders in schools, districts, and state departments of education in over 24 states and territories in support of implementation of evidence-based intervention and assessment for students with intensive learning and behavior needs.
As I think about other aspects of the improvements over 10 years, I think about our initial focus was kind of at a school level, which is the way OSEP initially, the initial funding priority was to focus at a kind of a district school level. And as I think about it, that was really critical because that enabled us to understand kind of what it was going to take to really do this work in school buildings.
The center learns from the implementation of the TA and revises the next TA effort to reflect what was learned, and continually repeats this cycle. NCII has done a terrific job with this iterative process.
And in the same way, OSEP and its fellow federal research agencies at some point early in the NCII undertaking were funding very intensive efforts to broaden the pool of validated intervention tools that could be used as intervention platforms within the data-based individualization process. And thus was born the NCII intervention tools chart. And the same process of sort of gradually ramping up the technical criteria for what we should expect practitioners to think about when they're choosing not only the progress monitoring tools for doing DBI, but also the platforms, the intervention platforms that the interventionists in schools will start with in the DBA process. With the quality of what can be offered to the field has been supported by the technical assistance process that OSEP has funded. And so, the way I think about it is that there's a real synergy between the research and the technical assistance, where the two are working in cooperation to improve the tools that practitioners in the field have to do high quality intensive intervention.
When the center was refunded, there were a few notable changes. The first was that at that time, states were required as part of their state performance plans to include a multi-year comprehensive plan for improving the results for children with disabilities. And many of the state partners that the center was working with, they incorporated intensive intervention as part of those multi-year plans in order to reach the results for improving the results of children with disabilities.
One of the things that we name in our theory of action for our state systemic improvement plan, the data-based individualization is one of our coherent improvement strategies across content areas, right, across grade levels, across all of our school types. Like this is something that we've got to get better at over time if we want to change outcomes for students with disabilities.
Right. So one of the messages that Lauren and I really tried to communicate early on was that growth, just growth that keeps a parallel trajectory, isn't acceptable. That teachers were celebrating growth, which is well and good, but if we're not closing that gap and bringing students closer and closer to grade level standards, then just growth alone isn't good enough. So DBI gives them such a beautiful structure that takes these kind of more abstract concepts of intensifying intervention and puts them in a very doable format. And when we look at the taxonomy of intervention intensity and look across those dimensions, I think it's something that teachers can really grab onto, and problem-solving teams, IEP teams, can really grab onto those and systematically think about each of those dimensions to intensify intervention.
Another key feature of a key outcome of the second center was to really focus on working with their state and district partners about thinking about their systems of instruction and intervention in academics and behavior, instead of thinking about them as separate systems, really starting to think about them as more of an integrated system and identifying areas where there were overlaps.
So instead of asking frontline implementers to struggle with combining the academic triangle and then the behavior triangle for this most intensive tier of services, we needed to figure out how we could do that and support state and local efforts.
Children who have intensive behavior needs. Historically, this population has been isolated primarily in schools. Teachers are ill prepared for managing their social and academic needs. And for the longest time, when I look at outcomes for children with intensive behavior needs, they tend to be probably the worst among all children with special education. Higher dropout rates, higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of mental health needs. And so the notion that OSEP was going to fund a center that actually focused in on both providing intensive academic support and intensive behavior support, and that we were getting these top scientists and researchers and practitioners from around the country to talk about how we might think about integrating those two disciplines, was very exciting to me.
How do we support the spread of what the center has learned? How do we ensure that the knowledge is scaled up and that we continue to nurture the growth of the knowledge?
In addition to the center, OSEP has also made several key investments in our personnel development program area for addressing the needs of children that have high intensity needs. And one of the programs is the preparation of personnel in special education related services and early intervention.
Next, we created the Doctoral Training Consortia focused on intensive intervention to train future faculty, researchers, and teacher trainers with a focus or emphasis on intensive intervention.
By this a consortium model, we mean doctoral programs across several institutions that are preparing future leaders in the area of special education related services or early intervention. And when we say leadership personnel, these individuals, when they leave their training programs, they are going to move into the field and either serve as faculty or as administrators, possibly at the state or district level. And so these individuals will be teaching future educators, they will be conducting research, they'll be supporting professional development, providing services to the field, and supporting students that require intensive intervention.
And then we generated a policy letter from the OSEP director that stated, we believe there is a group of children in every disability category whose needs are so unique that they require intensive, individualized interventions that are specifically designed to address persistent learning or behavior difficulties that affect learning. These interventions and services provided under IDEA are implemented with greater frequency and duration than the interventions and services received by children with less significant disabilities. The policy letter, in essence, validated and somewhat codified the concept of intensive intervention. So, as you can see, all of this scale-up of intensive intervention started with NCII. For that, the disability field is grateful and appreciative of the work of NCII.
The importance of NCII's efforts and continued work is even more critical as we recover from the pandemic. Students with the most significant and intensive needs have had some of the greatest challenges during this time frame. In our return to full-time in-person learning, it will be most important that we spend our limited minutes on what we know works and making sure those that need us the most get our very best.
So we've been talking a lot about intensive interventions and the incredible accomplishments thanks to the Office of Special Education Programs. And I think it's really important to wonder about what's next. If we've accomplished so much, how do we sort of continue to build on this? Imagine a world in which the kinds of practices that were done in intensive intervention became truly part of a school-wide approach, in which the behaviors that were expected in all of their settings, and the responses to these behaviors were handled in the same way. So as I think about what's next, I'm imagining an opportunity for us to really intensify intervention. And this intensification would come by making what we know about intensive interventions a more integral part of what all teachers and educational stakeholders were doing. And secondly, by using those approaches in similar ways in both settings. So all of the stakeholders had the proficiency. Now, imagine this. What if we figured out a way for elements of these intensive interventions to be part of home practice? I'm not suggesting that parents become the deliverers of intensive intervention. We just had a year of that, and that's plenty. What I'm imagining is that they know enough about and feel comfortable with critical aspects of those features of intensive intervention, so that they can also provide practice and support in very typical settings in the home context.
Well, watching her improve is an amazing feeling because I watched her struggle for so long, and we kind of felt like we weren't sure where to go from here. And working with the graphs and everything, we see that we're on the right path and moving up, and she's starting to catch on to what she needs to be learning.